While we are gathering virtually today, we acknowledge that each of us is on the traditional territory of many nations across Turtle Island. We broadcast from Toronto, the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. Today, it is home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We offer this acknowledgement as a stepping stone toward honoring the original occupants, a testimony to the oppression faced by Indigenous peoples, and our commitment in this series to creating dialogues aimed at addressing such systemic injustice. Jody, how are you? And truly, I feel like we genuinely talk every day, but it's always so good to ask the question and really inquire for the real answer.
Well, the polished answer is I'm extremely lucky and highly privileged and doing fine, enjoying my life. The less shiny answer to that is I am currently in my bedroom. Welcome, Elevate, to my bedroom because my daughter's doing a Zoom dance class. Boom. That's what's going on at the moment. But I'm very lucky to have a room to go to, and we can eat, and we are healthy. And honestly, I thank my blessings for that every moment of every day. How are you today, my friend? It's wonderful to see you. Would love to hear a highlight of your week since we saw you last.
Long time no see. Today's been a good day. It's been a good week, and I'm on the journey of learning and at times unlearning. And for me, that feels like a really beautiful journey. And I have hope that more of us can look at the journey in that way as well.
I love that. Okay, let's go. I'm so excited for today's show. Let's get going, Rhea.
All right, because I'm like, we could talk every day. We could talk about this forever because we already do.
I love talking. I love talking all day with you, and I may be dialing you right after this to go a little more into the day, but let's get going on our show.
We are. Because we also have a really great show for everybody. So in today's show, we'll learn all about fostering a new way of thinking, about design, development, and how to serve a wide range of backgrounds, abilities, and identities. We had the chance to talk with social activist and world change warrior and a dear friend of ours, Spencer West. As a person with a disability, Spencer has faced huge obstacles only to triumph and show others what is possible. He's tackled challenge after challenge, learning to navigate in a world set against those with disabilities. Not to mention, he's climbed and summited Mount Kilimanjaro using only his hands and wheelchair. Spencer's words and actions have encouraged millions to stand up, face challenges, and embrace change. I am so excited to welcome our guest, Spencer West, a dear, dear friend of mine. And before we get started, for those who may not know Wild, can you tell us a little bit about your story?
For sure. Thank you. I'm so excited to see you both, and thanks for having me today. Yeah, a bit of my story. I know it's hard to see because we're in these little tiny screens right now, but I don't have any legs. I was born with legs, but I was born with a genetic disease that caused the muscles in my legs not to work. So as a kid, they were removed just below my pelvis so I could get around better. And, after my surgeries, my family and I were told, and I don't say this to make doctors sound like awful people because they were incredible. They just didn't know what to do with me. And so they told my parents that I may never sit up, walk, or be a functioning member of society. But we refused to believe that. So we sort of set out to just navigate the world to the best of our ability and adapt when needed and to go from there.
So happy that they did, because I'm just so happy that you're here and we get to have this conversation with you.
Before we get into talking about what we're here to talk about in great detail today, can you tell us a little bit about how did you find climbing Mount Kilimanjaro? Because I got to tell you, it's a dream of mine, yet my greatest fear, and you did it, and I deeply admire you. Tell us a little bit about that experience, if you would.
Yeah, so to be honest, that was never on my bucket list. I'm climbing a mountain was the farthest thing that I would ever want to do. However, sort of like 4 or 5 years into my speaking career, I was traveling about 200 days out of the year. And so there were two things that Kilimanjaro actually did for me. The first is, I was telling audiences that, you need to get involved with the causes that you care about, whether that's fundraising or raising awareness. But I'd never really done it myself. I'd done a few things here and there in high school and a few community things, but nothing to the scale that I was trying to push people to do. And I thought that just doesn't seem right. The other piece is traveling 200 days out of the year. For me, my love language is time spent with friends and family, whether that's biological or chosen. And traveling 200 days out of the year just didn't allow for that to happen. So Kilimanjaro fulfilled both of those needs. One, to like make a difference and show folks that it's possible, what I'm telling them to do. And two, to have like a really cool adventure and have 10 days of uninterrupted time with my buddies. So that's sort of where it all came from. And then we campaigned for an entire year and worked with a personal trainer. And then June of 2012, we climbed Kilimanjaro.
That is amazing. And I've heard that story before. And each time I'm just like, okay, but will he go again with me? We're not sure. But what did it feel like to actually get to the summit?
Yeah, when you're so tired and you're so exhausted from 7 days of sleeping in a tent and climbing every day, that when you get to the top, like I was with my two best friends, David and Alex, we like just collapsed into each other and just cried for a few minutes. They were suffering from pretty extreme altitude sickness, so they went and puked. We came back, took a photo, they went and puked again. They took another photo. But you know what? We took a second to just marvel at what we had done. And you're so high up that it's just under 20,000 feet. So you can start to see like the curvature of the earth from that elevation. So it was a beautiful moment, but then it's like then you just want to leave. You're so uncomfortable, and you're like, we did it. We took the photo. We raised over $500,000 for clean water. Cool, let's go.
It's so unbelievable. So I think, Spencer, a lot about your story still. And I often talk about you with my daughter because one of our life mottos is we can do hard things. And I think about when we're talking about hard things, like, as a highly privileged, white, straight, fully able-bodied woman, hard things are not as hard as what you had set out to do, which to many people would seem impossible. So you really are a beacon for us around what is possible. And I thank you for that. How do people in your life react when you told them this was something you were going to do?
Thank you. That's very kind of you to say, and I really appreciate that. Yeah, when I told my family first, and my mom was like, "Please don't do this. Don't do this." And my dad was like, "Well, why haven't you invited me?" So like it was like two different opinions there. But most people were pretty supportive. I'd never fundraised that large of an amount of money before, so I didn't really know what I was doing. So I reached out to a friend and said, he had a lot of experience in fundraising. Would you help us? And he was like, "No, I think this is a terrible idea for you. I don't wish this for you. No." And so then I really took some time to think about why we were doing it, and we really percolated over that and wrote it down. And so then I sent it to him, and I said, I just in case you're ever interested, this is why we're doing what we're doing. And he wrote back and he said, "I'm in." So it was a mix of things that we got, but ultimately it was positive.
Yeah, I
That's
love that
amazing.
you took that, instead of it being discouraging, you said, okay, let me refocus on the why and bring them in. And it was ultimately something that resonated for them as well. So I love that. Also, big shout out to Alex and David. Great two people that I've also met through you. So really, really love that you were able to share that moment with them. Couldn't think of two better people. But let's focus a little bit closer to home. Talk to us a little bit about how navigating the world is for you.
Yeah, it's really interesting to think about that from the context of a pandemic right now, right? That we are all experiencing what it's like not to have access.
Mm-hmm.
We're being told by the larger world around us that no, you cannot access these things right now. Now, obviously, it's for our safety and for our health, which is important. But you all are experiencing for the first time what it's like to have a disability in some regard and what it's like not to have access over things you have zero control over. And so I think it's an interesting juxtaposition of the two to then think about, whenever the world goes back to some semblance of what we used to think is normal, you all have access again, and folks like myself won't. And what that means is we won't have access to buildings, we won't have access to accessible washrooms, resources. There's so many things on a daily basis that are barriers, and I think it's important to remember that these are choices that we make. We choose to keep these barriers in place. We don't have to, but we do. And so for me, some of the main things that I experience are getting into buildings that don't have an accessible entrance, and sometimes the entrance is around the back of the building. So then you're being othered in a secondary way by saying, "Oh, we do, but we don't care enough to put it in the front, so you can come in the front door like everyone else, but it is in the back." So I think there's those things where I want to be clear, and like that's really kind that sure you're making it accessible, but again, to then make it even lesser, I find that challenging. And then the other thing is, for me, a lot of the barriers that I ran into are finding accessible washrooms. Like I can almost guarantee that most people would not want to walk in a public restroom on their hands and then go to the bathroom.
I hear you on that. And you spoke to some of those challenges, but I'm wondering, what are some of those challenges you've faced in the workplace?
Yeah, so it's been really interesting, and like so many of the social justice movements that we see, oftentimes it's not clear as day the things that you're experiencing. So I'll give you an example. When I was 15 and I wanted to get a job, I was going through and applying at all of the places that all of my friends were applying as well. Restaurants and retail and fast food, and they were all getting at least an interview, and I couldn't even get a phone call. Now, I want to be very candid that, like, I don't know 100% for sure if it was my disability. But my assumption is, based on my friends getting interviews, I had the same qualifications they did. And this was also in a very different time where, now we send our resumes and things in email. So you don't always see the person, that person, like, face to face. At that time, you did. You dropped your resume in. So I think people were afraid, at least in my instance, to be like, well, what does he need? I don't want to have to deal with this. It's a lot of extra work. Is my guess of what some of the things they went through. So I really struggled finding a job, or finding someone that could see that not only did I have a disability, but I also had the same qualifications as everyone else. And so for me, that's sort of what I experienced personally when it comes to getting a job. Now that ebbs and flows, and as I got older, it got a little bit easier, but I still are constantly feeling like I have to prove that I have the qualifications to do the job.
Could you share your perspective for leaders that are participating today, and or HR leaders or diversity heads who are really looking to meaningfully change the way that we are including our folks with disabilities at work?
Yeah, and thank you. This is a good question, and I think disability justice intersects with so many other movements as well, and it's sort of the same idea of like, I think it would be helpful for every business to take a step back and look at, do we have employees with disabilities? And they're not always visible. There are invisible disabilities as well. Mine is obviously very visible, so you can tell right away. But I think it's like taking that step back and looking at, do we have people of color? Do we have folks with disabilities? Do we have queer employees? And if we don't, why is that? Mm-hmm. And I think you have to start with those fundamental basic questions before you can get to what do we do. Because if you're not even looking at hiring folks with disabilities, like, or even looking internally at what you have already, I think trying to jump to the next step of like, what do we do, isn't going to be helpful. And so what that looks like is, okay, so then what does our building look like? What would our building need to do, or what modifications would need to happen to hire folks with disabilities? And to be very candid, most places, usually the cost isn't going to be that expensive at the end of the day. And to just be very candid, I'm guilty as this as well. For so many years, presenting, I showed videos that didn't have closed captioning. So I want to also be be kind and gentle in the fact that we all make mistakes and that, we're all learning this together, even someone like me who also is in the disability community. But I think, yeah, when we look at sort of the virtual space, it's, do you have closed captioning? Is every time that you are doing some larger event, is there an interpreter there that can also be on video for folks that might need that service? Or there's so many other things to think about. But those are some of the basic things. But I also want to highlight one of the positive things about Zoom, and specifically right now, is a lot of in my work and a lot of the research that I've done, a lot of people are afraid to hire folks with disabilities because of not only cost of accommodations, but will there be absentee? What sort of special accommodations will be made to their schedule? And I would say the majority of folks, what they actually need is just a little bit of a flexible schedule and to be able to work from home. Well, one of the beautiful things about the pandemic is that we've proved that we can work from home and we can work remotely. And a lot of folks with disabilities, their homes are set up for them to be accessible. So having this as a major option, once the world is back to some semblance of normal, will be very important for folks with disabilities.
Mm-hmm. I couldn't agree more. And I just really appreciate you saying that we've all made mistakes. And I think also everyone is at different levels in their learning journey. And so I think that one of the key things is to keep learning. And I would love for you to maybe share with us what's maybe one or two of the top things that some of your past workspaces have done to ensure that you felt seen and heard, or for you made you feel most seen, heard, and supported.
Yeah, yeah. The first job that I ever had when I was in high school, I worked at the Chamber of Commerce. And I'm originally from the United States, and our Chamber of Commerce was also an information center. It doubled as both. And I remember, I went through a government program called JTPA in the United States, which no longer exists, but they helped folks like myself find jobs and to help break down the barrier of seeing past my disability. And I remember when I went in for my interview, although my disability is prevalent in there, that wasn't the focus. The focus of the interview was my skills and my qualifications, and was I qualified for the job? And then the second part was, we think you're qualified for this job. Let's walk through the space and see what you would need. And you tell me, instead of making assumptions as to what I needed. And honestly, the only thing that I needed in that entire office was a stool to sit on because the counter was so high. It was like $20 from, your local store. That's all that I needed. And so for me, that's when I've really felt seen in the workspace, is those times when people don't make assumptions, they ask what I need, and then they're able to deliver, or collectively together we work on how can we make this space more accessible. And it's also having the forethought to think ahead of those things too. This isn't necessarily a work example, but a couple of years ago, I was at a new restaurant here in Toronto, and I went in and it was packed, and we didn't have a reservation, but luckily we waited and they sat us. And then the manager came over, and I thought, oh, she was going to say, sorry, folks, this is a reserved table. We gave it to you accidentally. But she knelt down and she looked me in the eye and she said, I'm so embarrassed. We have an accessible washroom, but it's not working. So I've spoken to the restaurant next door, and their whole building is accessible, and they are more than happy to allow you to come in and use their washroom. Like, that is what that should look like.
That gave me chills.
Yeah, it's the same. Judy, I was so emotional too. And no one had ever done that to me before in a public space like that. People who know me for sure. But that's the kind of care and forethought that we need to be doing, not only for disabilities, but all folks for inclusion. I think we all intersect here.
Absolutely. And I think there's so much power in the question, how can I support you? Jody, how are you feeling?
I mean, I can't even. I'm crying. I mean, it's really bringing about a very personal memory for me, actually. My mom has MS, and it's not something I talk about publicly very often. And she sort of has relapsing remitting, so uses a wheelchair sometimes. And we were in New York for my 18th birthday, and we went to the MoMA, which was like her big dream to take me there, and they were renovating the accessible entrance. As an able-bodied person, I, of course, cannot understand the experience that you have or that my mom has of not being able to enter spaces or go to the washroom in spaces. But when you encounter this sort of listening to a personal story like yours that you've shared, or being so up close with my mom in that moment, it changes you, I think. So my next question was sort of going to be, if you could tell the corporate leaders listening to do one thing to sort of shift the way we're including our folks, all folks, including folks that live with different forms of disabilities, what would that be?
Yeah, I mean, this is a big question, and I don't know if I fully have like the answer to it because in the disability space, there's so many different types of disabilities. So this is what makes it difficult, right, for everyone. But I think the important things to look at is, this is a community of folks that has the qualifications and the skills, and they're just looking for a chance, for someone to take a chance and say, yes, we want these folks in our business. And we could spend all day talking about so many of the positive things that folks with disabilities bring, along with their lived experience and their qualifications for these jobs. So I think number one, it's just providing that opportunity and that space and letting people know that it's like when we look at, as I identify as a gay man, it's like when I see the rainbow symbol at businesses, I'm like, yes, like I know that you support me. And it's, yeah. And it's the same. It's like, how do we let the world know that you folks as individuals and as businesses are fighting to end ableism, are fighting to make spaces accessible. And so it's being vocal about it and advertising about it and being intentional about letting folks know that it's a safe space for folks with disabilities. And, there's a beautiful quote in the disability movement that goes, nothing about us without us. And this idea that we want to help along this journey, but we need accomplices and we need allies. And again, as I said earlier, we consciously make the choice to have these barriers still exist for folks with disabilities, for the BIPOC community, and we can also choose to undo those, and we can choose to take action and do something about them. But it has to be all of us, and allowing the folks with disabilities to help lead that conversation as well. So.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I like that quote was so good. And I think I'd love to kind of round us off here with just sort of your thoughts on overcoming obstacles. I think it's something that obstacles don't discriminate. It doesn't matter who you are. We all will face an obstacle in one way or another. So maybe in your own opinion, what's something that's helped you overcome obstacles?
Yeah, I think what's helped me now that I'm a bit older and have some lived experience and have reflected on it. I think for me, I've changed the way I look at obstacles. Now, let me be very real that I can't do this all of the time, but when I have capacity, it's like I sort of look at them as like I'm supposed to be learning something here that I have missed. And this is supposed to help me evolve to wherever the next thing is that I'm supposed to go. So I sort of look at obstacles in that regard of like, okay, I'm supposed to learn from this. Now, sometimes it's just awful and there's nothing you can do. And then I do my best to try to take the time afterwards to reflect on what did I learn from this whole thing. And then the other piece for me is support. I just it's oxygen for me and I need it. Like I need it, and being able to ask for help is so difficult and so empowering at the same time. And so I think it's those two things of reframing. It's a lesson to be learned, and remembering that you don't have to do it by yourself. That you can support for you.
I love that. I just feel like after hearing that, I want to ask you one more tiny question, if I may. What does support look like for you as a friend? How can I support you better because I love you?
Yeah, how can I support you too? I love
right?
you
too. Right? We're passionate about support.
We are support squared.
I love this. No, listen. I think you're already doing it, right? Like here we are having this beautiful conversation that doesn't happen. So like having this platform for the three of us to discuss and learn and understand, I think is a great way to start with that. But I think the other thing is, and this is something that I've had to learn too, is sometimes we have to reach out, and we also have to say, hey, just checking in. Anything I can help with? Because I'm good at asking for help on the big stuff. I'm not so good at the little stuff. And so I think it's also that, taking that time to check in with each other.
Spencer, we are so honored that you joined us here today. Thank you for inspiring us, and thank you for giving me, Jody, and I know everyone at home a lot to think about. We love you.
Yeah, and go Google Spencer's talk of his whole story, because it literally will change your life, as it did mine, as it did Lily's, and come have him speak to your companies, because he's amazing.
Okay. Now a little dance, because we're doing a little dance with everybody before we're done. Hey, cheese.
Rhea, that was the most incredible, moving, energizing conversation. One thing I've been thinking a lot about, where historically folks might think about access as physical access. And he did talk about his, some of his experiences around that very important issue. But right now, given we're all digital, I'm thinking a lot about what does that mean in a remote working environment and in a remote world? How can we create an environment where all of the advances in technology and rapid deployment of new technology that have changed the way in which we live, breathe, work, interact, communicate, are accessible and inclusive to all of our folks?
Mm-hmm. One of the things that we talked about the most that stood out for me was, not making assumptions. And I think often people want to assume that based on the person's abilities or disabilities that they may not be able to do things. And I think what he spoke to and asking for support, asking how can we support you, is one of the top ways that he felt seen and heard at some of his previous workplaces. And that makes me think of a story that a friend shared with me from their summer program. There was a person there like Spencer who did not have legs. And for the zip line, there was a large hill that you had to go up. So this kid was often left out of that activity. And so finally, one of the camp counselors asked, how can we support you? What is that you need? And how can we help you do that? And the kid said, oh, I can just get up there by myself. I just need someone to have my wheelchair at the bottom on the way down. Everyone said, okay. And he walked on his hands and arms, went down the zip line. No one has ever seen that kid happier. And the wheelchair was waiting for them at the bottom. And that they shared with me that after that, that's now how they best practice, is asking them what it is that you need rather than assuming. And I just thought that was such an amazing way to approach support in real way.
All right, folks, that is all the time we have for today. But before you go, we want to send you all away with this week's challenge.
Yes. This week, we want you to check your assumptions. Think of the ways that you are potentially making assumptions about people with disabilities and how you can actively shift those to ensure you are making people in your environment, whether at home or at work, wherever you go, feel included.
Remember, we may not always get it right. In fact, most of us on an inclusion journey make a lot of mistakes. And it's important that we get back up and keep going, listening, learning, unlearning, and really think about who you individually can pull into the conversation and the design of the solutions, because we need the folks that we are trying to serve at the design table to help us when we are doing that.
Absolutely. And a special thanks to our featured guest, our dear friend, Spencer West. And most importantly, as always, all of you at home for joining us. So if you've got something to say, remember the conversation doesn't stop here. Give us a shout online and use the hashtag #ElevateEquality.
Next week, our guest will take us through how to ensure that the stories we're telling are inclusive. Really going to be a big session, one to go out on. Stay safe, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and we'll see you next time.